Nathan Law is a young Hong Kong activist currently in exile and based in London. He was one of the leaders of the Umbrella Movement in 2014, calling for political reform, and he and his fellow student leader, Joshua Wong, formed Demosistō in 2016. Nathan and the student leaders were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018 by US congressmen and British parliamentarians. Nathan warns that China's pressure on Hong Kong is part of a bigger strategy, China's bid to reshape the international order and to ratify its authoritarian policies at home. Addressing the Chinese Communist Party's global ambition is the foreign policy challenge of our times. So welcome, Nathan. Thank you so much for doing this. And can I start by asking you what place there is now for your Hong Kong values, those rights and freedoms which define your city, and what, in your view, is the political strategy of the Chinese Communist Party towards Hong Kong and the rest of the world?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and also thank you, Brightwood, for the invitation for this series of lecture. I'm really honored to be here. And definitely the questions of how to do with China becomes a really hot topic for every corner around the world, because its path, its influence now, and its aggression of becoming and shaping their own international order that's surrounded with authoritarianism is really shocking and influencing a lot of values that we all share, like democracy and freedom. And most importantly, China has been the leading role in this like autocracy pact, and its influence really shaken the values of freedom for the past 2 decades, since the early 2000s. And we've been talking about the decline of democracy. And one of the major reasons, I think, is we actually allowed the rise of this authoritarianism without any checks and balances. And that's something that we have to mend if we want to restore the liberal values that we all treasure. So for now, that becomes a very major questions of how to deal with China. And it has to come with what we did wrong before in order to seek the answer. So I think it's important that we, I think most of us already are aware that China is not going to a modernization path. We used to think that by engaging with them, by appeasing them with the growth of the economy in China, that it will eventually go for a path of more open society politically, and upholding rule of law, and embracing the values of democracy and freedom. But definitely the path of China for the past 2 decades definitely shows them that they're walking into the exact opposite path, which becomes a more authoritarian regime and concentrating more power. So it really becomes a major problem around the world. And I think for now, the very first thing that all of us have to do is to enhance our understanding to the Chinese Communist Party, to understanding their agenda, their goals, and the very core operational logic of the regime. As they are conducting one-party dictatorship, their priority is, of course, upholding their power, and will never spare any power with the other stakeholders in the society. And that is an important understanding, and all our strategies should surround it and start with it. For me, I think Hong Kong is definitely a very important example showing the change of the way China conduct policies and their diplomatic measures recently. In 1997, Hong Kong was handed back from the British government to the Chinese government, and the one country, two system began. In the first decade of the one country, two system, it actually went quite well. The freedom that we had since 1997 were still largely intact. And the reason why Beijing wants to preserve that kind of like shell of one country, two system is that its original purpose was setting an example for Taiwan, showing that the possibility of the so-called reunion and preserving their own freedom and democracy. So China had the intention of keeping up Hong Kong's freedom and a process of democratization in the first decades. But after that, when China has more confidence, they are identifying themselves the authoritarian regime as one of the more superior system than the democracy that we share, it starts to really abolish the role of Hong Kong as an example and trying to concentrate the operation in the notion of how to preserve their power, to remain complete dominance, and to quash the opposition in the city, so that you could see the deterioration of freedom of Hong Kong in the following years. And I think that kind of like change of treatment really shows the growing aggression of China. And by observing the situation of Hong Kong, we could really see that the Chinese Communist regime acting in this sandbox, how they would treat the freedom, the values that we all share. And actually, that is the exact attitude that they will possess when they interact with the rest of the world. So I think Hong Kong issue is definitely one of the things that we all have to pay attention to if we want to know more about China, if we want to craft a more all-round strategy to China. So I think that is the special parts of our Hong Kong story and the things that we should all know. So in the following part, I'm really I'm glad to share my understanding on the strategy of China and how the world should deal with it. So I'm really looking forward to the following conversation.
Thank you so much for that. You outlined it very well, and it's interesting that you mentioned immediately Taiwan. You know that what happened in Hong Kong, you know, will happen in Taiwan. I mean, President Biden last week challenged Xi Jinping over Hong Kong. But how do you see President Biden playing it in comparison to Donald Trump, who was quite tough on China? And what should we be asking for now?
I think the philosophy of dealing with China and the perception of positioning China as the most serious threat towards the liberal order of the world and, of course, democracy has been quite coherent in these two administrations, even though there are many other divergences or even conflicts in between these two administrations. But China policy is actually something that has a continuity, and they kind of like see it in a similar angle from a strategic point of view. But of course, in terms of how they execute the policy, there are a wide range of differences. For example, the Biden administration would definitely emerge and engage into more international organization and working closely with allies like UK and Europe and Japan and other democratic countries. And I think this is a very good way to approach to deal with China, because what we need now is a global perspective of dealing with authoritarianism. One thing I think this kind of like narrative went wrong is we always feel like the problem of democracy or human rights, it is like being enclosed in the notion of sovereignty, in the notion of internal affairs. But actually, from what we understand, the action of China, that kind of like expanding their authoritarianism, colluding with other autocracies, and making the legitimacy of global democracy decline, we have to be aware that actually the democracy crisis is a global problem. It's not something like individual problems spread around the world and we all stand aside because that is their internal affairs. I don't think that is the right approach for us, especially we've been through actually 2 decades of decline in democracy. And I think it needs collaborated and coherent and orchestrated actions from around the world, leading by democratic institutions, democratic countries, so that we can re-establish that kind of legitimacy of democracy. And the very first thing to do is to see it as a global problem. So I think that is very important that we see it level-handed with the climate emergency and other global problem, that we have to work together and come up with a clear vision, clear agenda, clear goals in order to curb that authoritarian influence.
Interesting, and President Biden has talked about convening a sort of gathering of democracies, hasn't he? Which maybe that step, and perhaps G7 would be the other the other place for it. Can I ask you some sort of more specific questions? So on public service broadcasting, the broadcasters from Australia, Canada, Europe and the United States are standing with the BBC after its world news was banned in China in retaliation of the over the Ofcom ban on China Global Television Network. Last year, HSBC chairman Mark Tucker warned Downing Street that actions against Chinese companies would lead to reprisals. And do you see this as the start for sort of tit for tat relations with China? And what would your advice to the BBC be?
Well, I think it is important that we, first of all, have confidence in our values and how we do journalism, and how our civic society is based on the values that we all trust. Free press is important, independent journalism is important, and these are the things that are absent in mainland China. And the way that they deal with BBC in China and the way that we deal with the Chinese state enterprise in the UK are different. We are upholding the values of free press and independent journalism, and we are not allowing this journalist institution become the disguise of espionage actions. But for China, they're just trying to conceal the truth and stop any other independent journalism becoming the watchdog of universal values of what's happening in the society. So we must recognize that these two sets of actions, they are completely different. One is protecting our values, one is against it. So I don't think it's fair to say that these two sets of actions are level-handed. And on the other hand, for me, I think it's very important that we should be aware of the infiltration and the threats of China and the other authoritarian regime posed in our internal system. One of the strategies that they're using, that they're trying to discredit the system inside out, to dismantle them, spreading misinformation, and do a lot of things to discredit democracy so that they could establish the legitimacy of autocracy. Our system should not be an assistance for them to achieve that goal. So I think the way that they will deal with the state media, the Chinese state media in the UK is legitimate. And I really hope that the other countries follow suit. For what's happening in China for BBC, I think definitely that will be a big scandal for China. And I don't think that for us as a champions for freedom and free press, we should be kind of intimidated by these actions and to squander our own values. So I think that might have been the outcome that we have to swallow. But I think if we can really be united and uphold our values, the world should really stand behind BBC. It's not about politics. It's about a basic values that we all share, and to really resist this retaliation from China.
That's really interesting. So you'd like to see a sort of global solidarity from media organisations on this. And I guess one thing that keeps coming up is how we engage with China. You know, that we still want to trade with China. We want to be talking about climate change. You know, there's a body of opinion that says, you know, if we're going to solve these big problems, we can't exclude China. And yet it's, you know, how far you're prepared to, as you would see, to appease some of the ambitions of China. And I'm interested, Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, talked about a sort of specific issue we have, which is that Hong Kong's a big commercial centre. You know, HSBC is a huge presence in Hong Kong. But Dominic Raab said that Hong Kong should not be sacrificed on the altar of bankers' bonuses. The CEO of HSBC says we're trying to stay out of politics of one country versus another. How do you do this difficult balance of keeping Hong Kong commercially viable, but without, as Labour's Chris Bryant put it, aiding and abetting one of the biggest clampdowns on democracy in the world?
Well, I think first of all, the way that we should deal with Hong Kong is we have to recognize the truth. Hong Kong is no longer autonomous part. It's becoming an ordinary Chinese city, and the fact that the reality is that we should not see it as an autonomous region, and that incurred a lot of policy consequence, and that may hamper the economic activity there. But that is the reality. We cannot just disguise ourselves that nothing has happened in Hong Kong, and its one country, two system is still doing well. It is not. It's basically that after the implementation of the national security law. So I think under that big picture, I think all the policies follow surround that reality and the fact. And I think on the other hand, you've asked about the policy to deal with China about decoupling.
Yes,
I think
how we engage.
Yeah. I think it's the intertwined world. It's difficult for us to sever two camps surrounded with ideology. But I think we also have to be very vigilant about how we can make human rights and freedom in the front and center when we craft our policy. It's important that we set these criteria as precondition of engaging with China instead of engaging with them without any accountability and without any monitoring on this human rights violation. And we have to make sure that we understand the cost of engaging with China. Sometimes when we talk about being assertive to China, there are people jump out and say that, have you recognized the cost of economy on that? There will definitely short-term cost of it. But what they have been neglecting is the long-term cost of our democracy, of our human rights, and possibly our relationship with other democracies that is much more fundamental than the ones with China. So I think sometimes we really need to understand that engaging with China or doing business with China sometimes is actually is not using human rights to, is not like exchanging human rights with interest, but is exchanging short interest to a long interest. I think these are the mindset that we have to amend when we think of dealing with China. And I think it's important that we have a human rights centered, value-based diplomacy and commercial ties with them in order to really restore our democracy.
That's interesting. So it can't be just sort of trade versus human rights. You know, you've got to have it joined up policy on that. And you know, what we have seen sort of recently. I mean, it's interesting that you're saying that we're still treating Hong Kong as a separate entity, but it really isn't. That's a sort of facade. And do you sense in Hong Kong that people are feeling that we're seeing now the numbers of Hong Kongers who are coming to Britain? There are those with a British national overseas status and those on Chinese issued passports with 6-month visas. I've read about 7,000 Hong Kongers have sought settlement here. But do you see a sort of diaspora, or what do you see happening to young people in Hong Kong particularly?
Well, there are different opinion on leaving Hong Kong. Of course, there are people who wanted to leave Hong Kong because of political instability, or some of them face imminent political suppression. But there are other groups of people, they feel like no matter how small the room of resistance is, they have to be there to resist and to try to chant the opposition in their beloved lands. So I think there are different groups of people thinking about the same problem. And I think for me, I'm really grateful for the government to provide a safe exit for the people who face political suppression, imminent ones, so that they can escape from the unfair judicial system and to pursue their life in a free land. But of course, I think the numbers of that won't be very massive. There are 3 million eligible BNO holders, and the estimation of the government is around 100 to 200,000 for the first year. And my estimation is like around 100,000 because we're living in a pandemic. There are a lot of instability, so that may also become a hindrance for people from leaving. And the situation now is very dynamic. If the political situation in Hong Kong gets worsening, then it may encourage people from leaving. But if the external environment of the world keeps actually quite unstable, then it also encouraged people to stay. So I think it's quite a dynamic situation now.
So yes, it's interesting what the effect has been of the pandemic on the politics. That do you think it's changed the relationship in any way between China or Hong Kong, or it's made it it's made it easier, I guess, to break down that two systems?
Authoritarian regime has a tendency of abuse their power in an emergency state. So definitely the COVID pandemic, it makes Hong Kong into an emergency state. So the government has the authority in the name of public health to ban public gathering, to arrest people. But actually they're doing it because of political reasons. For example, the ban on public gathering, the government has been limiting people in groups of 2, in groups of 4. But sometimes when protesters came out as an individual, as one person, they also prosecute them or charge them with the ban of public gathering. And it becomes very convenient for them to suppress the voice of people and to conduct political suppression with less and less international attention, because people around the world are very concerned with the public health crisis and domestic affairs. So I think in these emergency states, definitely the authoritarian regime will abuse that kind of power expanded, and they will not squander it even after the pandemic. So that is a very worrying signal and situation in Hong Kong.
We've seen that as a general sort of threat, haven't we? That that public health can be used by authoritarian states. And I've got some questions now coming in. The first is, do international agencies such as the UN need to work harder to prevent undue Chinese influence within them and crack down on violations of their values? Do you think that the UN has become sort of weakened and weak towards China?
Well, definitely. I think UN, WHO, and other international organizations, there are problems in it. China has been using a lot of strategies to consolidate their supports, and a lot of the original purpose of these organizations to promote human rights, promote democracy, have been compromised because of China's sophisticated ways of dealing in these gigantic international organization. So
what are the strategies that they use, may I ask?
Well, for example, they've been making a lot of diplomatic ties with African countries since the 1960s, and making sure that whenever they need their vote and they need their helps in this organization, they will be on board. And it makes the rules set by this international organization becomes just a voting game instead of promoting certain values, instead of encouraging nations to work towards a free and more democratic future. And I think there are multiple incidents of how China has been abusing this mechanism to preserve their authoritarianism and stop them from being criticized. So I think it's important that even though we have to continue to utilize the power of these organizations, the legitimacy of them, we need to carry out reforms so that these authoritarian regimes, they're not using these organizations to protect themselves, and democratic countries could actually do something with it instead of just being silenced by it.
So when you talk about the sort of the international multilateral agencies that, for instance, President Biden would want to be working through in a way that President Trump didn't, what are the ones you trust? I mean, do you trust the World Health Organization, for instance?
Well, I think, of course, we understand that conflicts around the world, public health crisis, we need international response. We need organizations that can consolidate everyone's efforts and to help out in these occasions. But on the other hand, it's so obvious that, for example, from the past year, WHO has been kind of compromised with China's agenda and making that kind of monitoring on how China deal with the pandemic into the minimum effectiveness. And I think that there are major problems in these multilateral organizations. And I think, for example, if Biden administration wants to engage with them, it must carry it with a reform proposal instead of just pretending these organizations are all functioning well. And I'm actually willing to see that there are major reforms in these organizations so that we could cut that influence from China.
And what kind of reforms do you think are necessary?
Well, definitely there are lots of details to be discussed. A lot of UN specialists have coming out with a lot of reform proposal. Human Rights Watch have come up with something that can really strengthen the voice of preserving human rights and freedom, instead of just letting the sophisticated ways of infiltrating these organizations by China work its way around. So I think that there are major concerns over it, and we should be really discussing on how we can fix the problems in these organizations instead of just pretending they're all right.
That's really interesting. We've got some more questions, and for people wanting to ask questions, just to say, remind you, it's via Slido, hashtag Ludgate Lectures. So next question is, how is public opinion on China's role divided within Hong Kong? Are there strong generational and socio-economic divides?
So we could assess that from the latest opinion poll. The latest opinion poll of the pro-Beijing handpicked chief executive for Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, her popularity, if I have not mistaken it, is minus 50%. So there are around 40% of people giving her 0 marks. You can see how extremely unpopular the government is. And if this is a government in Western democracies, they will be thrown out or people will revolt because of how unpopular they are. But for now, she still gets the blessing of Beijing and can continue to uphold the power that to become the leader of the city. So I think there is a certain bipolar political opinion in Hong Kong. But of course, the majority of people are standing with the people in the protest and standing with the values of democracy. So this opinion poll really shows a lot of things. And I think the way in Hong Kong, it should not be saying that, oh, it's a bipolar society. It's actually a society that most of the people standing shoulder to shoulder to the protester and supporting democracy. And the people who support Beijing are just like marginal minority in the society, but their voices are being exemplified by the Chinese state media and by the people who wants to show that China indeed play a role in Hong Kong. So I guess that is what's happening in Hong Kong.
Is there a generational divide that we see that it's the students who were protesting? Is there an older generation that would prefer a sort of quiet life or to try and find some accommodation, or does it not divide as simply as that?
Well, data indeed shows that there are some divergence in terms of how they feel their identity and how they feel their relationship with China across generations. But I think in the protest movement, we also have observed a lot of older generations coming out, especially they have organized their own protest and becoming quite a vocal voice in the movement. And I think there are indeed divergence of how they see the importance of stability in their lives. But in general, this is like the protest movement in Hong Kong. The participation from all across age group are there, and I think it still have the overwhelming support.
And do you see? I mean, you said in that the pandemic's been used, to suppress or to protest. There's the security laws. I mean, is there? What's the future of protest, and what hope, I guess, is there for people like you who are fighting for Hong Kong values?
Well, I think the future lies in every one of us. I think the government has been trying really hard to crack down the civic society, to destroy the social fabrics, to destroy the connectivity of every one of us, so that there aren't much organized protest or opposition force can be formed. To be honest, under the national security law, the government has been operating quite severely in that front, and people are just now, it's like the storm is coming, so we better lie low and try to see whether we could rise up after the storm. So we're actually in the low points of our movement, but I don't think people are just hopeless. There are actually a lot of potential for resistance. The discontent of people are there. Like for example, for me, I'm in another role compared to where I had been for the past couple of years, and trying also to facilitate that kind of like awareness for Hong Kong, and trying to, even though it may be minimum, but at least get as much support as we could to the cause of us, who we all share. And I think it is important that we keep that momentum, we keep that inner strength. So for me, the future is indeed like in each one of us, as long as we don't give up, as long as we find the possibility of channeling our voice and bringing changes, even though in the darkest time.
And it was interesting that we saw that sort of tactics at the time. You know, people talked about a sort of water and a sort of lack of leadership, which helped the protest movement go forward. Are there, presumably you're thinking of sort of other ways, particularly when there is we know there is an end date to all this, and so it's whether it's a sort of reform of whether it's getting China to change, or it is still trying to save that bit of that peninsula, that of Hong Kong.
Well, I think of course it is a much broader questions of how China can change, and what mobilized China to change, and how effective that could be. For me, I think the Hong Kong protest is actually showing certain side of democracy and side of people pursuing freedom to the people in mainland China, even though it is very limited due to the nature of the internet firewall, and also the very sophisticated propaganda machine from the Chinese government. But actually, there are certain spill out effects, even though that is minimum, and that I've observed throughout the time. And for the change in China is actually a massive topic, but I think that there will be certain change in the foreseeable future, due to the model of China, how the Chinese Communist regime has been operating. So there are two major pillars of the legitimacy of China. That is nationalism and also the economic growth. So people just like tacitly signed a social contract with them. They're giving out their mandate as long as their lives are being enhanced, and that kind of like strong nationalistic narrative are still influencing them instead of public mandates. But at the end of the day, when China's economic growth slow down, and they're facing like middle income trap, there are a lot of problems they're encountering when they are doing industrial transformation, when the world has been united to kind of like isolate them in terms of all these manufacturing options. And they will have problems of gaining legitimacy, and they will need to sort some other ways of getting people's support once its economic growth is not as strong as before, as the past 2 decades. Change may emerge from that period of time. We don't know when it will exactly be and what form it will take. But of course, as long as China continuous aggression around the world, is wolf warrior diplomacy, the process of being isolated around the world because of their aggression, I think like that kind of change could emerge, and that will be a legitimacy crisis for them.
And that's interesting, the economic growth, as you say, because that, you know, that's been the difficult thing, I guess, for sort of liberal democracies. You're against an authoritarian regime, which is also where the economy is at the moment. So I guess in terms of what advantages liberal democracy has against that is an alliance, or are there any other factors sort of inherent in liberal democracy, which means that there are strengths that we maybe haven't even thought about in confronting China?
Well, I think the very first thing is the mandate of people. Economy is one part. What is part of the equation of how the government can get legitimacy. But one thing that China lacks is a regular election. Is the mandate of people. So the economy means much more in terms of political stability for them. And I think that is their weakness if you're talking about what crisis that countries will face. And in terms of dealing with China, in terms of how the world can have effective policies that could force China to change, I think alliance is indeed the most important one. And it comes with a change of perception, perceiving China in front of the authoritarian pack and threatening liberal democracies. And we see it as a global problem with global solution. So I think for now, as long as we can gather up alliance around the world, if democracies are stick together, they are over half of the GDP of the world's GDP. And if they have actions together, setting precondition, a human rights precondition in the trade agreement with China, urging them to eliminate all these human rights violations in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, I think this is the very first step that we should do in order to protect our values that we all share, actually.
And do you think there could be some consumer choices too made then? We've talked about governments, but other things individuals should be doing?
Well, of course, there are lots of consumer movement ongoing. For example, the boycott of the Xinjiang cotton, that consumer refuse to buy products that are made of forced labor in Xinjiang. And this kind of consumer movement is important. But I guess it is another, it is in the other spot in the equation. What's more important is also the engagement of the government, and also we are creating a culture that we stop seeing freedom as granted and democracy as granted. They'll be here forever. We understand how easy it could be eroded and how easy it could be influenced by authoritarian regime. So I guess the perceptual change is important, and we have to start it now.
I've got some more questions coming in. So one is, has the offer of residence visas from the UK made any difference in terms of the safety and well-being of Hong Kong activists?
Thanks for the questions. I myself, I'm not entering UK with the route, with the BNO scheme. I'm now applying for political asylum. So that's because I don't have that passport. It serves the people who were born in Hong Kong before 1997. So
you're going the visa route then? Is that which seems to be the other one that, yeah.
Oh, I'm just entering the country with a political asylum seeking claim.
Yeah.
So it really depends on individual case. But I think for a lot of people who have BNO and they're facing political suppression imminently, it's always good that they have a safe choice, as a safe harbor that they could flee from, and then to begin their new life, and possibly also raising awareness for Hong Kong issue from elsewhere.
Thank you very much for that. And I've got one from Ronald Lehman. Princess Latifah is in the news. Does the UK react fairly in our condemnation of Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum and China's own treatment of its citizens? So that's, I guess, is there an analogy?
Oh, sorry, pardon me?
It's, I guess, in the it's the broader question is the UK reacting fairly in condemnation. So at the moment, we've been talking about things that have been happening in sort of Dubai and other places in the world. But I guess the broader question is, do we fairly distribute our human rights foreign policies? You know, do we sort of make exceptions where we've got trading links or so? And I guess that's something that's come up, you know, to do with Hong Kong is always that of who you condemn and who you don't, and where you've got relationships and so on. So does it need to be uniform?
Well, definitely, I'm not an expert on UK's foreign politics, so foreign policy. So I'm unable to provide a very all-round answer on these regards.
I guess it's it's that question of how much human rights should dictate your foreign policy.
But I think that there's one particular issue that stands out from China is authoritarian expansion. The expansion, their authoritarianism around the world by one Belt and Road Initiative by Asian Investment Bank, and of course the recent example would be exporting their technology on the Great Firewall to Myanmar, to the military government, to help them to block internet access to specific social media or foreign websites in order to retain their control internally. So that I think that kind of like aggression from China, the authoritarian expansionist, is something that makes the world more aware of the nature of it, and with that kind of like intention of doing more to them. So I think that is one thing that's why China becomes more an issue than possibly than the other part of the world. And I think undoubtedly a nation like the regime like Chinese Communist regime is definitely leading the way to pave the world for autocracies. And that's something that we really have to counter and to curb the influence as much as we can.
And we've talked about what liberal democracies can do, and about alliances and governments and so on. Are there and consumers and individuals? Are there any other sort of blocks that can come together? I mean, the tech companies seem to be sort of defeated by China a bit. They think, oh well, they just can't get in. But is there anything more you would expect or hope from the big tech companies in their dealings with China?
Well, of course, we always observe that big companies caught in between or in a dilemma. Let's put it in this way. There are lots of policies in China that violate their core values, but of course that is a huge market. So sometimes they want to appease them for the sake of economic growth. That of course is something that we could understand from a commercial point of view. But I think there are some grounds that we should stand very firm. For example, there were incidents about like Apple refusing a consumer to craft certain protest slogans on their products, and small things like that. Indeed, really shows actually business can have more persistence and can defend more grounds when it comes to protect individual freedom and the freedom of choice, instead of blindly following the threats from Chinese government. But of course, that really have to be a consolidated effort. China is well known of like picking out singling out certain companies and punish them as hard as they can in order to set it as an example for the other company. But if we can really consolidate our efforts, then maybe these companies are too big to be punished by China. Then there are more bargaining chip on the table. Then the individual freedom can be more protected. So I think that there's something that really needs the discussion of these big companies.
It's interesting. It's back to that solidarity, isn't it? That people are going to have to stand together. And I've got another question from Lawrence Brooks, which is: do you think UK universities are too dependent on Chinese funding?
Well, definitely. No matter in US and UK, Chinese students is the largest source of international students. And well, to be honest, it's actually good for the people who live in authoritarian regime to be exposed to the free world when they have the free access to information and understanding how democracy operates. But on the other hand, there are also risks for espionage activities. And I've personally heard a lot of examples of Chinese students who are liberal-minded being monitored by their fellow students and being reported and afraid of doing something that could be seen as subversive in the Chinese Communist term. For example, when I was studying at Yale, I was approached by a Chinese student saying that he really wanted to come to my talk, but he couldn't, because if he's being spotted, then that will bring him trouble. I think things like this are indeed happening around the world. And I think that's something that the UK authority should look into, that people studying in the UK, no matter what their nationality is, they are able to enjoy freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and to pursue academic freedom without this hindrance from autocracies. I think that is something that we really should look into. The operation of the embassy, the operation of the so-called Chinese student organization, and their relationship with the embassy, and all the actions that they've been taking. And I think reducing the dependency also on the students, the research, and also in terms of business is actually the trend that we should pursue forward. And especially the schools should review their ties with the institution in mainland China, the source of funding. And it really is about the national security and how we could stop our technology and our national interest being compromised. And I think these things should be transparent, and big universities should really show the responsibility of it.
It's really interesting because, of course, you're right. We want the intellectual exchange. We don't want, China isolated, and we want freedom to be sort of available to all. But if it's being sort of monitored or manipulated, then it becomes difficult. So it's finding what that body is. Thank you very much for that. And can I just ask? We've talked a lot about Hong Kong, and we've mentioned Taiwan, and your sense that it's sort of Taiwan next. Could you just tell me a bit more about the position of Taiwan, and what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think one story I've heard from China reporter that I've had a conversation with was by the time Xi Jinping wanted to revoke the term limit of presidency, he made a promise that in order to achieve the national rejuvenation, he would kind of like solve the Taiwan problem in his term, and it takes more than 2 terms. So that was the premise of the leadership in the party to allow him to achieve something that to revoke that kind of like limit set by president leadership in the Chinese Communist Party, and allowing him to be a long-term emperor in Hong Kong. So I guess Xi Jinping has all the intention to do aggressive moves to Taiwan, even though in modern days we think that warfare in between major countries are unlikely. But I think as the basis of Xi Jinping's power built on the so-called reunion or annexation of Taiwan, then there is a possibility that more and more military conflicts would take place in between the trades. And definitely we have to stand shoulder to shoulder with Taiwan, because it's a well-functioning democracy. It really contributes a lot in terms of promoting democracy in a broadly Chinese community. And it's blatantly and just one-sided aggression from the Chinese Communist Party, and we should all prevent it from happening.
Yes, because I remember the Hong Kong protesters in China, China today, Hong Kong tomorrow, and presumably that's now that sort of moves to Taiwan. And so is there any sense that you talked about what would bring about change, and one is, a sort of a solidarity amongst liberal democracies. Is there any appetite at all for reform within the Chinese Communist Party? Is there any sense of change coming from within, or does it have to come from outside? Do you feel that the authoritarian sort of ranks are pretty much unbroken?
Well, I think we should not pay too much hope on the party reforming themselves. Rather, we should put the hopes on the people. We believe in the inner nature of freedom seeking, of humanity. And it's important that we have to believe when the conditions and when the moment comes that people will resist, just like what's happening in Myanmar. So I think it really takes time and the possibility of change to achieve a genuine change in China will only be under certain conditions. The people will stand up and say that we want our government to represent ourselves, and we want to cast our vote to them. And that I think what we are doing is to curb that influence of Chinese Communist Party, making sure that the world has been really monitoring its actions and minimizing the human rights violation, and to a point that people in China also feel like there is a necessity for them to speak up.
So you think just continual scrutiny sort of really matters, does it then?
Well, of course, on the other hand, the democracy has to develop their defending mechanism. For example, the high scrutiny on Chinese enterprise in for example, in UK, the education institutions, they should really be aware of the funding from China. They have to be through a strong vetting process, and for Chinese propaganda machine, no matter they're operating in the country or on social media platforms, they should be eradicated if it's sponsored by authoritarian regime with certain propaganda purpose. It's not about squandering freedom of speech, but it's actually defending these platform from being abused by a very orchestrated action from the Chinese Communist regime. Of course, it has to meet a certain concrete high standard, but I think it's important for us to really single out all these propaganda from the other people's opinion and to have measures to cope with it.
And what do you see for your own future? So you're applying now for political asylum. How long does that process take? Do you know?
Well, it normally takes 6 months, but it's a promise that may not be made. So I have no idea when it will be approved, and I'm going through the general application process. So I really hope that my case is strong enough, then they will approve me as early as possible, so that I may be able to go to the convocation ceremony in May at Yale when I received my master's degree. So I really wanted to be there in person.
Oh, well, best of luck with it. And thank you very much indeed for your time today. It's been fascinating. And I know how much the audience have appreciated.
Thank you so much.
Giving us this time. So thank you. So thank you very much. Well, keep in touch and best of luck.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Bye, Nathan.